My name is Leif. This is Dan. Do you mind stating what your profession is and what your name is? Sorry, just to clarify.
Hi, Leif. Yep, my name's Danny Lang. I currently work at the Canadian Mental Health Association here in Ottawa, so we're the Ottawa branch. I am a registered social worker, psychotherapist, and I work in community mental health and substance misuse.
How do you find cannabis affects mental health in general from your perspective?
Um, Cannabis is so from my experience, cannabis is a really interesting substance in terms of it really does impact people really differently. And so where some people they may have the euphoria or the calming effect, others may actually experience paranoia, um, heightened 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 anxiety, states of anxiety, really uncomfortable in their bodies. Their minds may start to think and behave in ways that, or think in things that they're kind of puzzling to them and wondering why they're thinking or feeling this way. Um, and so it's just, for me, cannabis is a really tricky one. And it does, for me, seem to be quite person specific. And so when I'm talking with somebody, I'm always curious about what and how cannabis impacts and works with them, and how they, their perspective on the world as well.
That's totally fair because I know, like for myself, it's really affected my it's affected my motivation and my anxiety definitely changes quite a bit from that from cannabis use, and that's a really cool way of looking at it too. I mean, it does have a huge impact on different people, different ways. Um, so
Yeah, and I think it's why, sometimes when we look at it, we can't just say in a blanket statement that it cannabis does this or cannabis is bad this way, because for some people that's not been their experience, and why we have to really be look at it in a more holistic experience for people and how it impacts them, both um, benefits but also how it could be problematic for people as well.
totally, because then you're invalidating someone's experiences if you
That's
use it as a
right.
blanket statement.
And yeah.
Cool, cool. So you mentioned that it brings up it alters with anxiety. Like I know for myself, it's definitely affected me and my anxiety. Have you noticed this at all in your studies or your fieldwork, I should say? And how does that? What does that look like? I should ask is what I'm trying to ask. Sorry.
So, like, are you specifically asking how cannabis
Plays
creates
with
anxiety,
anxiety.
or are you asking, is it how people use cannabis to maybe help resolve anxiety? Which are you referring to?
How it plays with anxiety. So like, and the overall, if it how it affects. What I'm trying to ask is basically with anxiety, what it looks like if someone's trying to use it to cope with anxiety, and if how it would look like in general from your perspective.
I think so. For me, one of the ways I think about it is anxiety is a state that people experience to lesser or greater degrees, and um, sometimes anxiety is telling us something. And I think from how I see it, or I like to help people try to think about it, is what might be anxiety saying to you, or that state. Is it fear? Is it something else? And what might it be saying to you? And is there other things you could be using, other skills or things to calm that anxiety before you go only to cannabis? And so people have stated and told me that cannabis can be really helpful for them. And at the same time, if that's all you're using to manage your anxiety, I just wonder at some point, will it always be as effective as it once was? And then at what point would you need to bring in other skills or things to help manage it? Because often anxiety is speaking to us about something that we're not happy about, or we may have to do, or and so how do we listen to what anxiety has to say as well? Um, and maybe not always be cannabis be the first thing. And I guess the other piece to this is for people who use cannabis problematically, or use it and forgive the term, but use it long term, they may be some of the anxiety or the irritability, that they experience may even be withdrawal. If they don't have the substance for a few days, people may experience withdrawal symptoms, and they do experience withdrawal symptoms with cannabis use, frequent cannabis use.
It's totally true. I know from my own experience, like I get the shakes. Used when I quit, I was getting the shakes, and it definitely played with my like it. I would smoke more tobacco as well. Have you noticed anything like the relationship between cannabis and tobacco at all?
Yeah, you mean you'll probably hear people talk about it frequently, and how um, people will roll cannabis into their joints to make it last longer. But there's also a when the two substances get together, there's also a bit of an effect that happens. And I'm not going to be able to explain it to you because I don't got all the genius in my head, but there is definitely a psychological effect between when the two substances get together, that people do find pleasurable, as well as it burns, makes the cannabis burn a bit better. And so there is a relationship that happens between tobacco and cannabis. We definitely know this. It's very common that if somebody's using cannabis, they will be using tobacco, and vice versa. And when they are trying to make changes, say around their tobacco use, it's very frequent that you may see a rise in their cannabis use, or vice versa. I want to get back on my cannabis use, then my tobacco is going through the roof. So they kind of become this paired couple, almost like sometimes I joke about it, like a married couple. And we're trying to, they work really well together. Sometimes if we're trying to cut back on it, we have to have this kind of healthy separation between the two, which makes it difficult. But definitely there's a relationship. And some people call one of the terms is co-smoking. I think there's other terms that people use when they put tobacco into their cannabis. For me, I just see it as, if I'm going to talk to you about cannabis, I often want to talk to people about tobacco use and vice versa, because of how well they go together.
Yeah, it's a really interesting analogy. Yeah.
Because I guess for me, Leif, I'm really worried about sometimes, not worried is a strong word, but concerned about people's. So from my experience, I'm worried about lung health. And so if I'm using combustibles, whatever that may be, tobacco or cannabis, and I'm lighting it up, that's going to impact my lungs. And so for me, I'm concerned about how that impacts someone's lungs, and then what's the long-term effect on it. And I think from my experience with people who have smoked cannabis frequently, they do have a lot, seem to talk about respiratory stuff earlier in their age than say somebody else, and that doesn't say smoke cannabis or tobacco. And so it's a concern. And how are we looking after our lungs? And I think people want to be able to look after their lungs because they want to be healthy. They want to be able to exercise. They want to be able to get out. They want to be able to climb stairs, et cetera, et cetera.
No, totally. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, because I find it has a big priority on health, and that's huge because like with cannabis and tobacco, it I don't want to say it's unhealthy, but it's not good for the lungs, and that's enough to say.
Yeah, well, and how many times you've been told to quit and that it's bad for you. But I think for me, I'm more concerned with people's lung health and how they're looking after their lungs, because I think that's less parental, or yeah, it's just people are used to having to defend cannabis for so long, especially people who have been using it in secret for so long because it was illegal. And so now that it's a legal substance, and people are able to do it, I don't want to get in an argument about this or that, or it's natural, it's not. I'm more concerned about having conversations with people about how they're managing their life, and what else can they be doing besides cannabis that can help them get through. And I think one of your questions was to live a life, either worth living, or what their goals are, or one according to their values.
That's totally fair because their values. I mean, my values affect what my practices are. I mean, my practices agree to what my values are, and it's very interlocked. I find. Um, yeah, no,
Yeah,
that's very interesting.
yeah, because we're trying to think about, if I'm living a life according to my values, what does life look like for me? Like, how much meaning does it have, or how much value does it have for myself? And that's, I guess, for me, what I'm trying to think about with people as well.
That's really looking
I
out
don't.
for their care.
I
That's like
hope.
you know for someone. I think.
I hope I'm answering your questions. Is that fair? Like, am I
Yeah, no,
answering
no,
your? Okay.
that's very interesting, and it's always good to hear some input from you too. Um, so, in terms of identity, like I don't know, it's an anthropological term that we use a lot, identity, and I find that when I use cannabis, from my own perspective, from my own experience, I should say, um, I it brought my self esteem and a lot of frustrations up to play. I'm wondering how does it affect identity in terms of the individual, or from what you've seen or what you've noticed?
So, are you referring to, like, if I was to say that I'm a
I'm a
pot
pothead.
smoker, or my community is pot smoker, or I identify as a uh, somebody who smokes cannabis, but that's my identity. Like, that's what I've embraced. Is that what you're asking me?
Yes, exactly.
And then are you? And then that transition away from that, or the transition to reducing? And just
Well,
if you
well,
could help me out a bit, what do you want me
so
to? What do you
in
think?
terms of identity, like what does it look like? Not what does it look like. Sorry, I'm struggling with this a little bit myself. um, with cannabis, how does it play with identity? I mean, like if I when I was a pot smoker, I found that it was really it really affected me, and I always thought I couldn't do this or I couldn't do that because I'm a pot smoker. What's the point? And I find like why is that? Like how does that? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things. Let me throw out a few things.
Yeah.
Um, I've heard people say that that was an identity that they picked up when they were, say, that was the group that accepted them. So when they were trying to find themselves, or, and I use that term loosely, so forgive the term, but when people are in maturing, coming to themselves and figuring out who they are and where they fit in this world, sometimes I think that community is very accepting and not judgmental about who you are and what you're doing. They just, it's about just smoking, and I think it could be very welcoming for people. So that identity can be, people do identify with that population or that group. The other thing is, I think sometimes there's stereotypes associated with people that smoke cannabis, and sometimes people take on those stereotypes, whether they believe them or not, or have felt judged or targeted or labeled because they smoke cannabis. And I've heard it so many times from people that they've taken on that identity. It's like somebody saying that you're not intelligent, and you've heard it 10,000 times. Well, you start to believe it yourself, and I think it can be very similar to for a lot of substances. But I think that's one that there's always been the stereotypes of the stoner, the these types of things that people get targeted or labeled with. And so, yeah, I think identity is a big piece, because the other flip to this is, if I identify as that stoner, or whatever that word you identify with, it is a change when you might start to make changes in your life, and maybe you don't want to smoke cannabis anymore. Then that becomes a that person's starting to search for, where do they belong, who are they, these questions that, yeah, no, they start to answer for themselves.
Yeah.
If I'm not going to smoke cannabis, then who am I? You know what I mean?
No, totally. That brings me back even to this day sometimes. Like I've put cannabis, and I'm still doing my best to stay harm free and harm reduction with NRT and things like that. And I find that I was going somewhere with this. Give me a second. Sorry. Um, with cannabis, like I remember when I was quitting, I was always trying out different things, trying to see what I do like and what I don't like, and I'm still exploring them sometimes, figuring out well what works for me and what doesn't. And that's really interesting that you say that, because it speaks to me in levels.
Yeah, and I don't see it as bad or anything like that. I just see it as, this is an identity that people pick on. And I just, for my concern is, it's like somebody being taking on the identity of their mental health or their mental illness, and then believing that that's all they're capable of doing. And I don't necessarily, and I think that's what you were originally asking me. So I'm sorry if I'm getting back to it in a roundabout way. Is
So,
that you're more than just that. If I only see myself as somebody who has schizophrenia, then I'm missing all the good and all the other things I do in my life, like all the things that make me Danny. Um, I'm only focusing on that one piece. And I think for me, when somebody only focuses on being X, then we're missing all the other things that they bring to the table as well. Is that
what
fair?
it said, yeah, no, totally, totally. That brings me to one more, my last question, I should say. I really appreciate you taking your time to do this. So when it comes to mental health, spiritual health, physical health, and mental health, like we've talked a lot about how it affects mental health, the identity piece, emotional health. What does that look like in terms of cannabis? Like I know when I quit, it really affected. I was definitely getting mood swings, and but it was a lot easier to handle when I was willing to quit, opposed to when I had to.
Yeah, sorry, I kind of got a little bit caught in
No
the
worries,
question.
no worries. So my
So
question.
one thing,
Sorry.
yeah. So it's just if you give me the question again, if you don't mind, I was just reading it as well. So my apologies.
Yeah, no worries. So in terms of like how cannabis, how is it tied to the mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual health? Because like I know we've touched a lot upon a lot of these things, but I just like to make that clearer.
Yeah, yeah. I think for me and how I see it, I think traditionally in a lot of different systems, um, we target people for what we see. So sometimes in the mental health system, I only see somebody from the perspective of what their mental health or what's going on with their thoughts, or that I get locked into that. And for me, in a medicine wheel and an indigenous perspective, in terms of a medicine wheel approach, and not like I'm a genius on it, but just to say I appreciate how we're looking at the holistic of a person. So for me, when I'm thinking about cannabis, gets tied not only to our mental health, but physically there can be withdrawal from it. It could be helping with body sensations. It could be tied to that. It could be tied to our emotions. So all emotions, whether I'm experiencing them positively or not, or negative, and I don't want to get in positive negative, but in terms of if the emotions are charged or their joy or happiness, cannabis can be tied to my emotions, and it could be tied to my meaning and purpose. In terms of what I find value in every day. Like meaning and purpose could be the hunt, the search, the picking, the drawing, the calling of looking for cannabis. I could find that could be a piece of how I see the world. And so um, when I'm talking to somebody about it, or I'm having that conversation with somebody about cannabis or tobacco, I'm always thinking about how it's linked to all facets of them as a human being, not just maybe um, around their mental health. Because maybe somebody does notice that it helps their mental health, but it's impacting their lungs, and it's impacting their emotions and making their emotions all over the place. Therefore, they're more willing to talk about those and make changes around that than maybe if I keep focusing only on talking to them about their mental health. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It really
Because
does.
if I'm having asthma related experiences from smoking, then maybe I want to make some changes around it because of my lung health. Um, and if my whole day is spent in the search of cannabis, maybe people are willing to look at other ways of how we can nourish their spirit and bring and make them connected to nature, to the people, to their community, more meaning and purpose in their life, connect with their values. Like maybe that's where we focus on. So I think it just allows us to see people as a holistic person, not just as once again getting away from that identity or that identity they may feel like they're stuck in.
Very cool. Because like that brings me to a thought in my head about like mindfulness and how that's affected my life, and how using just the moment and persevering that meaning and purpose in the very moment that you're in was really helpful for me and beneficial. And I mean, it's helped change my life around. Yeah, I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing your experiences as we've been chatting today. No, it's nice. It sounds like, I mean, you've done a lot of work to get to where you are now.
Certainly have.
Yeah. Yeah.
I really appreciate your time. Is there any last comments or thoughts you have or want to say? Anything? No pressure, just optional, of course. We covered a lot, though.
One of the things you did say, I wonder when cannabis is considered problematic for an individual. I think it's important to know that there's a few things. One, sometimes small amounts of a substance could have great impacts on people's mental health. So I don't have to be smoking cannabis every day to always have negative impacts on my mental health. So that could be problematic. So it might not look like I'm smoking a lot, but I could have real negative effects on my mental health in terms of like paranoia or fear, or brings up or it brings up great states of fear inside of me, or anxiety. Like problematic is, for me, we got to explore that because it's a big word, right? I
Yeah.
often think too, like how much of my focus, my agenda of every day is focused on the substance. So if I wake up and I think about cannabis all day, and I'm not doing the things that I used to like and love and participate in my community or do things, that may start to make me think, well, maybe there's something, this is going in a way that I don't want it to, or it could be considered problematic in a loose term. You know what I mean? I don't
Yeah.
like that kind of word, but just to think about it, we often, do you crave it? Are you kind of your everyday regime has kind of been focused on it? What's your tolerance like? A half a gram used to be enough, but now I need a gram or more to get the same effects. These are things that we start to think about as well when it becomes problematic, potentially problematic in my day. Tolerance, do I crave it? Am I obsessing and thinking about it frequently? These types of things. But then to really think about it too, and what we just spoke about: physical, mental, emotional, spiritual. How does it impact me? And people often know whether things are not, going in the way they want. And the last piece, I think, is um, when my behaviors don't match up with my values, it's definitely a sign that I'm going in a direction that I don't want. And then how do I course correct so that we can work together, work by yourself to course correct the way you want to go?
Change of behavior, change of thought. Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah. Well. Thank you so much for your time, Dan.
Yeah, I hope I've answered the questions the way that was helpful to you, or I hope it's been useful for you.
It was excellent. I really appreciate your time and effort.
Okay, thank you, Leif. It's great to see you. Thank you.
Right on. See you, Dan.